Millionaire fired his virgin Maid, but lost control when he saw her with a date at the dance. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. She learned to become invisible long before she understood why it mattered. Jasmine Rowe moved through the marble hallways of the Blackthorn mansion like morning mist, silent, graceful, and easily forgotten. Her worn sneakers barely whispered against the polished floors as she carried fresh linens up the grand staircase, each step calculated to avoid the creaky spots she'd memorized after 18 months of employment. At 24, Jasmine had mastered the art of existing without being seen. Her grandmother had taught her well, "Child, sometimes the safest place is in plain sight but quiet as prayer." Those words echoed in her mind as she folded Egyptian cotton sheets with the same careful precision she applied to everything in her life. The mansion towered over Seattle's Queen Anne neighborhood like a fortress of wealth and old money. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of Elliott Bay, while imported chandeliers cast dancing shadows across rooms larger than most people's entire homes. For Jasmine, it was simply work, a means to keep food on the table and pay for her younger brother Damon's physical therapy sessions. She paused outside the master bedroom, adjusting her grip on the laundry basket. Through the partially open door, she could hear him, Graham Blackthorn, the mansion's owner and her employer. His voice carried the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, discussing overseas investments with what sounded like a European client. "The Shanghai market opens in 6 hours," he was saying. "I need those numbers confirmed before then." Jasmine had seen him only in passing. A tall figure in perfectly tailored suits, always moving with purpose, always surrounded by the weight of important decisions. To him, she was part of the household machinery, necessary but unremarkable, like the automated irrigation system or the security cameras that monitored every corner. She slipped into his bedroom, working quickly to strip and remake the massive four-poster bed. The room smelled of expensive cologne and leather-bound books. Everything was precisely arranged. His watch collection in a mahogany case, business journals stacked at perfect right angles, even his sleep mask folded exactly 3 inches from the lamp. As she tucked the final corner of the fitted sheet, a photograph on his nightstand caught her eye. Graham stood beside a woman with platinum blonde hair and a smile that seemed painted on. They looked perfect together, wealthy, untouchable, belonging to a world where people like Jasmine existed only to serve. The sudden sound of footsteps in the hallway made her heart skip. She grabbed the dirty linens and hurried toward the door, but froze when she heard his voice, much closer than expected. "Yes, I understand the risks," Graham was saying, just outside the bedroom. "But sometimes the greatest rewards come from the most unexpected places." Jasmine pressed herself against the wall beside the door, praying he wouldn't come in. Her pulse hammered in her throat as she listened to his conversation continue down the hall. When silence finally returned, she exhaled slowly and made her escape. The library was her next stop, a 2-story sanctuary filled with first editions and rare manuscripts. Graham rarely used this room during the day, making it Jasmine's favorite place to clean. She could take her time here, sometimes stealing glances at the book spines and imagining the stories within. As she dusted the mahogany shelves, she found herself humming softly, an old gospel song her grandmother used to sing while cooking Sunday dinner. The melody seemed to belong in this quiet space, weaving between the leather-bound volumes like an invisible thread connecting her past to this strange gilded present. She was reaching for a book on the highest shelf when it happened. The melody escaped her lips in a whisper of song, barely audible but somehow filling the vast room with unexpected warmth. Amazing grace! How sweet the sound! What Jasmine didn't know was that Graham Blackthorn had returned early from his conference call. He stood in the library doorway, frozen by the sight of his invisible employee transformed by something as simple as song. For the first time in years, Graham Blackthorn saw someone in his house as more than just staff. And everything was about to change. What happens when someone who spent their whole life being invisible suddenly becomes the only person someone can see? Would you risk everything for a love that could destroy the life you've carefully built? Or would you stay safely in the shadows? He told himself it was coincidence the first 3 times. Graham Blackthorn had built his fortune on patterns, recognizing them in market fluctuations, in competitor behavior, in the subtle shifts that preceded either great success or spectacular failure. So when he found himself scheduling his morning coffee, exactly when Jasmine arrived for work, he convinced himself it was simply routine optimization. But routines didn't explain why he lingered by his office window, watching her walk up the curved driveway with that same unhurried grace. She carried herself like someone who had learned not to take up too much space in the world, yet something about her presence filled every room she entered. It had been a week since the library incident, a week since that voice, soft and pure as morning rain, had stopped him dead in his tracks. He'd stood in that doorway for a full minute, watching her dust his books while humming hymns his own grandmother might have sung decades ago in rural Alabama, before the family money had erased such simple pleasures. Now, as he pretended to review quarterly reports, Graham tracked Jasmine's movements through the house, like a man studying a fascinating equation he couldn't quite solve. She was in the main hallway now, polishing the banister with careful, circular motions. Her dark hair was pulled back in that same practical ponytail, but today a few rebellious curls had escaped to frame her face. She wore the standard grey uniform required of all household staff, yet somehow she made it look elegant rather than institutional. Graham's business partner, Lawrence Pike, had arrived an hour ago for their weekly strategy meeting, but Graham found his attention drifting from market projections to the gentle sound of furniture polish being applied in careful strokes. "You're distracted today," Lawrence observed, following Graham's gaze toward the hallway. "Everything all right?" "Fine," Graham replied too quickly, forcing his eyes back to the spreadsheet. "Just thinking about the Morrison acquisition." But when Jasmine passed by the office doorway, carrying fresh flowers for the entryway vase, both men fell silent. She moved with unconscious rhythm, like someone who found music in mundane tasks. Graham noticed how she paused to straighten a crooked picture frame, a small act of care that had nothing to do with her assigned duties. "She's been here over a year," Lawrence said quietly, after Jasmine disappeared around the corner. "Never seen anyone so careful, like she's afraid of leaving fingerprints on your world." Graham's jaw tightened. He didn't want to discuss Jasmine with Lawrence or anyone else. These observations, these small discoveries about her character, felt too private to share. "We should focus on the presentation," he said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Throughout the meeting, Graham caught himself listening for her footsteps, the soft click of doors closing, the whispered conversations she had with Mrs. Holloway, the head housekeeper. He learned that Jasmine always worked the same route through the house, kitchen first, then living areas, finally the upstairs bedrooms. She never took breaks longer than 10 minutes, and she always knocked before entering any room, even when she knew it was empty. When Lawrence finally left, Graham found himself standing in the foyer, pretending to sort through mail he'd already organized twice. He told himself he was waiting for an important call from Tokyo. He told himself he needed to inspect the cleaning quality in the main rooms. He told himself many lies that afternoon. Jasmine appeared at the top of the grand staircase, carrying an armload of fresh towels. She moved down each step with deliberate care, one hand trailing lightly along the polished rail. When she reached the bottom, she looked up and froze. Their eyes met for the first time in over a year of shared proximity. Graham felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than employer meeting employee. Jasmine's eyes were the warm brown of coffee with cream, and in them he saw intelligence carefully hidden beneath practiced deference. "Good afternoon, Mr. Blackthorne," she said softly, lowering her gaze as protocol demanded. "Jasmine." Her name felt strange on his tongue, more intimate than he'd intended. "How long have you been working here?" The question seemed to surprise her. 18 months, sir. "And you're satisfied with the position?" She hesitated, and in that pause, Graham glimpsed something he hadn't expected, a sharp mind calculating the safest response. "Yes, sir. Very much so." But her fingers twisted in the fabric of the towels, and Graham realized she was nervous, not just professionally cautious, genuinely affected by his attention. "Good," he said, then immediately felt foolish for such an inadequate response. Jasmine nodded and turned toward the laundry room, but she moved slower than usual, as if she could feel his eyes following her, and she was right. Graham watched until she disappeared through the service door, noting how she glanced back just once, so quickly he might have imagined it. That evening, as Graham sat in his study reviewing contracts, he found himself listening for sounds from the staff quarters. The house felt different when Jasmine was gone, like a grand piano with several keys missing. He wondered what she did with her evenings, where she lived, whether she had family or friends who knew her as more than just the quiet girl who cleaned rich people's houses. He wondered if she ever sang when she thought no one was listening. The next morning, Graham made a decision that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. He rearranged his entire schedule to be home during Jasmine's shift, and for the first time in years, Graham Blackthorne found himself looking forward to something that had nothing to do with money or power. But he had no idea that Jasmine Rowe was beginning to notice him too. The teacup trembled in her hands, and Jasmine prayed he wouldn't notice. Thursday afternoons had become different since their conversation in the foyer. Graham now requested tea service in his study, something he'd never done in her 18 months of employment. Mrs. Holloway had raised an eyebrow at the sudden change in routine, but Jasmine had volunteered before anyone else could be assigned the task. She knocked softly on the heavy oak door, balancing the silver tray with practiced ease, despite her racing heart. "Come in." Graham's voice carried that same authoritative tone he used with business associates, but when she entered, Jasmine caught something softer in his expression, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Your tea, Mr. Blackthorne." She set the tray on his desk with careful precision, avoiding his gaze as she arranged the delicate china cup and saucer. "Thank you." He paused, and she could feel him watching her movements. "Jasmine." Her hands stilled. "Yes, sir. You don't have to call me sir when we're alone." The statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to name. Jasmine's pulse quickened as she processed his words. In her world, such informality could mean many things, none of them typically ending well for the employee. What should I call you then?" she asked, finally meeting his eyes. "Graham." The name sounded different when he said it to her, less like a title, more like an invitation. She nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Is there anything else you need, Graham?" Hearing his name in her soft voice did something to him. She could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his fingers tightened around his pen. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed with an urgent call from London, and the moment shattered. "That will be all," he said, his professional mask sliding back into place. But as Jasmine turned to leave, she heard him add quietly, "Same time tomorrow?" She looked back, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "If you'd like, I would." 2 words that changed everything. The next morning, Jasmine stood before her tiny bathroom mirror in the studio apartment she shared with her brother Damon, studying her reflection with new uncertainty. Her uniform looked the same as always, pressed grey dress, white apron, sensible shoes. But something in her face had changed. There was awareness now where there had once been careful blankness. "You're different," Damon observed from his wheelchair in the kitchen, his voice carrying the playful authority only younger brothers could manage. At 19, cerebral palsy had limited his mobility, but sharpened his perception of people and emotions. "I'm the same as always," Jasmine replied, pouring his orange juice and avoiding his knowing look. "Nah, you've been humming again. Real songs, not just the nervous humming you do when you're worried about bills." He grinned, his smile identical to hers despite their different fathers. "And you spent 20 minutes deciding which uniform to wear. They're all identical, Jazz." She sat beside him at their small table, a hand-me-down from their grandmother covered with a cheerful yellow tablecloth that had seen better years. "It's nothing important." "Is it someone at work?" Jasmine's silence was answer enough. "The rich guy?" Damon's eyes widened with concern. "Jazz, be careful, men like that—" "It's not like that," she interrupted, though even she wasn't sure what that was anymore. He asked me to call him by his first name. That's how it starts." Damon reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "I just don't want you getting hurt." But as Jasmine caught the bus to Queen Anne that morning, she realized she was already in danger, not from Graham's intentions, but from her own treacherous heart that had begun to hope for something she'd never allowed herself to want. The day passed differently than usual. During lunch prep, she found herself wondering what Graham ate when he wasn't conducting business meals. While dusting the living room, she noticed family photographs she'd overlooked before. Graham as a boy with an older woman who must have been his grandmother, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. When tea time arrived, Jasmine's hands were steadier. She'd spent the morning talking herself into treating this like any other work interaction. But the moment she entered Graham's study and saw him reading glasses perched on his nose, concentration softening his usually sharp features, her resolve crumbled. "Jasmine." He looked up as she set down the tray, and this time he smiled, really smiled, not the polite expression he wore for housekeeping staff. "Graham." His name felt more natural now, though it still sent a small thrill through her. "I hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing to the book in his hands, "but I was curious about something. Yesterday I heard you humming in the library again. It was beautiful." Heat flooded her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I know I should be quiet while working." "No." His interruption was gentle but firm. "Don't apologize. I was wondering, where did you learn to sing like that?" The question was so unexpected, so personal, that Jasmine found herself answering honestly. "My grandmother. She raised me and my brother after our parents died. She sang all the time, while cooking, while cleaning, while braiding my hair. She said music was the Lord's way of making hard work feel like worship." Graham set down his book entirely, giving her his full attention. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. Jasmine's voice softened with memory. She passed 3 years ago, but sometimes when I'm working, I hear her voice in my head, and I can't help but hum along. And your brother? Is he... Damon, he's 19, he has cerebral palsy, but he's the smartest person I know. He's taking online college courses when we can afford them. She paused, realizing she'd shared more about her life in 2 minutes than she had with anyone at work in 18 months. Graham was quiet for a moment, and Jasmine worried she'd overstepped some invisible boundary, but when he spoke, his voice held something she'd never heard before, genuine warmth. "You're not what I expected," he said softly. "What did you expect?" He studied her face as if memorizing it. "Someone less remarkable." The word hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, and in that moment, Jasmine realized she was falling for a man whose world was as far from hers as Seattle was from the moon. The rain started just as Jasmine's bus broke down. She stood at the covered stop on Capitol Hill, watching the metro bus driver shake his head apologetically as smoke poured from the engine. The next bus wouldn't arrive for 40 minutes, and she was already running late for her shift. Graham's morning tea service had become as punctual as his business meetings, another routine in his precisely ordered world. Jasmine pulled out her phone to call Mrs. Holloway, but the screen remained black. Dead battery. She'd forgotten to charge it again after staying up late helping Damon with his economics assignment. The rain intensified, turning the October morning into a grey wash of frustration. Other passengers scattered toward nearby coffee shops and storefronts, but Jasmine counted the bills in her wallet. Barely enough for lunch, certainly not enough for a taxi to Queen Anne. She was calculating whether she could run 12 blocks in the rain without arriving completely soaked when a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The passenger window rolled down, revealing Graham Blackthorne's concerned face. "Jasmine, what are you doing here?" Her heart did something complicated. Part relief, part embarrassment, part something she couldn't name. "My bus broke down. I was trying to figure out how to get to work." "Get in." It wasn't a request. Graham was already reaching across to unlock the passenger door, his usual authority tempered by something that looked almost like worry. Jasmine hesitated. Accepting a ride from her employer crossed lines she'd spent 18 months carefully maintaining, but the rain was soaking through her jacket, and she was already 20 minutes late. She slid into the passenger seat, immediately overwhelmed by the scent of expensive leather and Graham's cologne. The car's interior was immaculate, not a single coffee cup or loose paper to suggest its owner was anything less than perfectly organized. "Thank you," she said quietly, buckling her seatbelt. "I'll pay you back for the gas." Graham glanced at her with something between amusement and exasperation. "Jasmine, I'm not going to charge you for a ride to work." The way he said her name, like he'd been practicing it, made her stomach flutter. She folded her hands in her lap and stared out the window as they navigated through morning traffic, hyper-aware of every small sound, the whisper of windshield wipers, the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers, Graham's steady breathing beside her. "You live on Capitol Hill?" he asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "A small apartment near Pike Street. Damon and I moved there after our grandmother passed." She paused, then added, "It's not much, but the bus route was convenient." "Was? The city's changing the line next month. I've been trying to figure out how to get to work without adding 2 transfers." She immediately regretted sharing this worry. It made her sound unreliable, unstable, but Graham's response surprised her. "What if we adjusted your schedule? Started earlier, ended later? I could arrange transportation." Jasmine turned to study his profile, trying to read the motivation behind such an offer. In her experience, wealthy people didn't solve their employees' problems without expecting something in return. "Why would you do that?" Graham was quiet for several heartbeats, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Because losing you would be inconvenient." The word hung between them, inadequate and loaded with meaning neither was ready to explore. They spent the rest of the drive in silence, but it felt different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. When Graham pulled into the mansion's circular driveway, Jasmine noticed Mrs. Holloway watching from the kitchen window, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Thank you again," Jasmine said, reaching for the door handle. "Jasmine," Graham's voice stopped her. "About the transportation arrangement, think about it. We can discuss details tomorrow." She nodded and hurried toward the staff entrance, but she could feel him watching until she disappeared inside. The day passed in a blur of whispered conversations with Mrs. Holloway. "Everything all right, dear? You seem flustered," and stolen glances toward Graham's study. When tea time arrived, Jasmine's hands were steadier than they'd been in weeks, as if the morning's kindness had settled something anxious in her chest. Graham was waiting for her, standing by the window instead of sitting at his desk. The afternoon light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and Jasmine realized she'd never really looked at him, not as a man, just as an employer to be navigated carefully. "How was your day?" he asked as she arranged his tea service. The question was so normal, so unexpectedly domestic, that Jasmine almost smiled. "Productive, thank you. And yours?" "Better now." The words slipped out before Graham could stop them, and Jasmine saw him tense as if he'd revealed more than intended. She busied herself straightening the already perfect tea setting, trying to process the implications of his admission. "Graham?" His name felt natural now, familiar. "About this morning. I have a proposal," he interrupted, turning from the window to face her fully. "Not just about transportation. I've been thinking about expanding the housekeeping staff, adding some specialized positions." Jasmine's heart sank. He was creating distance, re-establishing professional boundaries after this morning's intimacy. "I don't understand. A personal assistant position, someone who could handle my private correspondence, manage my personal calendar, coordinate with household staff." He paused, studying her face. "Someone I trust. You want me to be your assistant?" "I want you to be more than invisible." The admission hit her like a physical force. All these weeks of careful observation, of tea services and stolen conversations, crystallized into something real and terrifying. "Graham, I'm not qualified for that kind of position. I don't have business training or—" "You're intelligent. You're discreet. You pay attention to details others miss." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "And you're the only person in this house who isn't trying to impress me, or manipulate me, or use me for something." "Because I'm nobody," Jasmine whispered. "No." His voice was fierce, certain. "Because you're exactly who you are. And that's what I've been looking for, without even knowing it." The space between them seemed to vibrate with possibility and danger. Jasmine knew she should step back, should remind them both of all the reasons this was impossible. Instead, she found herself asking the question that would change everything. "What happens if I say yes?" Graham's smile was answer enough, but neither of them saw Mrs. Holloway standing in the doorway, her face creased with worry, as she witnessed the moment when employer and employee became something else entirely. The crystal wine glass shattered against the marble floor like her carefully constructed world. Jasmine stared at the spreading pool of burgundy liquid and glittering shards, her mind blank with horror. The expensive Bordeaux, Graham had mentioned it cost more than she made in a month, now stained the pristine white marble of the main hallway like spilled blood. "Oh God," she whispered, dropping to her knees without thinking, her hands reaching instinctively to gather the broken pieces. "Don't!" Graham's sharp command stopped her mid-motion. "You'll cut yourself." But the damage was already done. A thin line of red appeared across her palm where a shard had sliced skin, and Jasmine watched in fascination as her blood mixed with the wine on his perfect floor. She'd been carrying the tray to the dining room for Graham's meeting with distinguished European investors, men in $1,000 suits who spoke in hushed tones about global markets and political instability. One moment she'd been walking with her usual careful grace, the next her foot had caught on the edge of the Persian rug, sending her stumbling forward. The sound of breaking crystal had been impossibly loud in the quiet mansion, echoing off the high ceilings like a gunshot. Now, as footsteps approached from the dining room, Jasmine felt her chest tighten with panic. She knew what came next. She'd seen it happen to other staff members who'd made costly mistakes. Quiet termination, a final paycheck, and the swift erasure of their existence from this pristine world. What happened here? The voice belonged to one of Graham's guests, a silver-haired man with a thick German accent, who looked at the mess with undisguised disgust. "An accident," Graham said evenly, but Jasmine could hear the tension beneath his controlled tone. "Nothing that can't be cleaned up." She finally looked up at him, expecting to see the cold fury she'd witnessed that day with the landscaper, who'd damaged a prized rosebush. Instead, she found something worse, disappointment, mixed with what might have been regret. "I'm so sorry," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll pay for the wine. I'll work extra hours. Jasmine," Graham's voice cut through her rambling apology. When she met his eyes, she saw a stranger, not the man who'd asked her to call him by his first name, not the person who'd offered to change her life just yesterday. This was Graham Blackthorne, millionaire businessman, returning to the role she'd forgotten he could play. "Clear this up and report to Mrs. Holloway," he said with professional detachment. "We'll discuss this later." The German investor made a sound of approval. Quite right. One must maintain standards, even with the help. Something flickered in Graham's expression at those words, but it was gone so quickly Jasmine might have imagined it. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him turn back toward the dining room without another glance. Mrs. Holloway appeared within minutes, armed with cleaning supplies and a carefully neutral expression. She worked beside Jasmine in silence, helping to mop up the wine and collect every last shard of glass. "How bad is it?" Jasmine finally asked as they disposed of the last paper towel. The older woman paused, studying Jasmine's face with the kind of maternal concern that made her throat tight with unshed tears. That bottle was from his personal collection, a gift from his late father. The words hit like a physical blow, not just expensive, irreplaceable. Jasmine closed her eyes, feeling the last of her foolish hopes crumble to dust. "He'll let me go." "Maybe," Mrs. Holloway said gently. "But Mr. Blackthorne isn't always what he seems. Sometimes he surprises people." But when the European guests finally left 3 hours later, Graham's expression hadn't softened. He found Jasmine in the laundry room, mechanically folding towels with trembling hands. "My office now." She followed him through the mansion's corridors, past the scene of her humiliation where only the faintest wine stain remained on the grout lines. Each step felt like walking toward an execution. Graham's office felt different now. Not the intimate space where they'd shared tea and tentative conversations, but a corporate battleground where she was about to lose everything that mattered. He sat behind his massive desk, every inch the powerful businessman, while she stood before him like a defendant awaiting sentencing. "Do you understand what happened today?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. "I ruined your meeting. I embarrassed you in front of important clients. I destroyed something precious." Her voice cracked on the last word. "You did." Graham's agreement felt like another blow. "Those men represent $100 million investment opportunity. First impressions matter in my world. I know. And I failed you completely." Jasmine lifted her chin, trying to salvage some dignity in defeat. "I'll pack my things. Will you?" Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. The harsh fluorescent office lighting cast shadows across his face, but she caught a glimpse of something unexpected in his expression. "I assume you're firing me." Graham was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him in the pose she'd seen him use during difficult negotiations. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. "What you cost me today wasn't just money, or even that wine. You cost me the ability to pretend this isn't happening. I don't understand. Those men saw how I looked at you when you fell. They saw me step toward you before I remembered who I'm supposed to be." His laugh was bitter, self-directed. "In 30 seconds, you undid years of carefully maintained professional distance." Jasmine's heart hammered against her ribs. "Graham, I can't have you working here anymore." The words fell between them like a blade, sharp and final. Jasmine nodded, blinking back tears she refused to let fall in front of him. "But," Graham continued, rising from his chair, "I meant what I said yesterday about the assistant position." "What?" "I'm firing you as housekeeping staff." He moved around the desk, each step bringing him closer. "I'm offering you a position as my personal assistant. Different duties, different relationship to this household, different everything." Hope fluttered in Jasmine's chest like a bird testing broken wings. "After what happened today, after I proved I can't be trusted with something as simple as carrying a wine glass?" Graham stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of maintaining his public persona while wrestling with private desires. "Jasmine, you've been carrying my heart around for weeks without dropping it once. I think you can handle the rest." The admission hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying. And for the first time since the wine glass shattered, Jasmine allowed herself to believe that some broken things could be repaired into something even more beautiful than before. 3 days later, Jasmine stood in front of a mirror she'd never expected to see herself in. The executive bathroom on the second floor of the Blackthorne mansion had always been off-limits to housekeeping staff, a pristine sanctuary of Italian marble and gold fixtures that she'd only glimpsed while dusting the hallway outside. Now, as Graham's personal assistant, she was adjusting the collar of a navy blazer he'd had delivered that morning, trying to recognize the woman staring back at her. The transformation was startling. Gone was the grey uniform that had rendered her invisible for 18 months. In its place was a tailored suit that actually fit her curves, paired with low heels that made her feel taller, more confident. Her hair, freed from its perpetual ponytail, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked professional, capable, like someone who belonged in Graham's world, if only she felt that way. "Deep breath," she whispered to her reflection. "You can do this." The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of orientation sessions with Mrs. Holloway, who'd seemed genuinely pleased by Jasmine's promotion and crash courses in managing Graham's complex schedule. She'd learned that he owned properties in 6 countries, served on the boards of 4 major corporations, and received approximately 200 emails per day. She'd also learned that he took his coffee black, preferred phone calls to video conferences, and had a habit of working until nearly midnight when he was stressed. Most importantly, she'd learned that the line between personal and professional had become impossibly blurred. A soft knock on the bathroom door interrupted her thoughts. "Jasmine, are you ready?" Graham's voice carried through the thick wood, formal but tinged with something that might have been nervousness. She opened the door to find him waiting in the hallway, impeccably dressed as always in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her annual salary. But when his eyes met hers, she saw the same man who'd confessed to carrying her heart, vulnerability barely concealed beneath expensive tailoring. "You look—" He paused, his gaze traveling from her face to the navy blazer and back again. "Perfect. Professional. Thank you." She smoothed the skirt with suddenly nervous hands. "I feel like I'm playing dress-up." "You're not." His voice was firm, certain. "You belong here, Jasmine. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The words settled something anxious in her chest, and she found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time since the wineglass incident. "So, what's first on the agenda, boss?" Graham's expression shifted at the playful title, something dark and complicated flickering in his eyes. "Don't call me that." "What should I call you then in professional settings, I mean?" "Graham, always Graham." He started walking toward his office, and she fell into step beside him. "The rest of the staff will adjust. What matters is that you're comfortable." But comfort, Jasmine was learning, was a luxury she couldn't afford in this new role. Every interaction felt loaded with subtext, every glance charged with unspoken possibilities. When Graham handed her files to organize, their fingers brushed and lingered a heartbeat too long. When she leaned over his desk to show him calendar conflicts, she was hyper-aware of his sharp intake of breath, the way his eyes followed the movement of her hair. The morning passed in a blur of phone calls and correspondence. Jasmine discovered she had a natural aptitude for reading between the lines of business communications, for prioritizing the truly urgent from the merely important. Graham watched her work with something that looked like amazement, occasionally offering guidance, but mostly letting her find her own rhythm. It was during lunch that everything shifted. Jasmine was reviewing catering options for an upcoming board meeting when Graham's personal line rang. She answered with the practiced professionalism she'd been perfecting all morning. "Graham Blackthorne's office, this is Jasmine." "Oh." The woman's voice on the other end carried the crisp authority of old money and newer disappointment. "I was calling for Graham directly. Is he available? May I ask who's calling?" "Victoria Ashford, his fiancée." The words hit Jasmine like ice water. She felt the blood drain from her face as she glanced toward Graham, who was reviewing contracts at his desk, oblivious to the call that was about to shatter her carefully rebuilt world. "One moment, please." She placed the call on hold with trembling fingers, her mind reeling. Fiancé. The word echoed in her head like a death knell. How could she have been so foolish? How could she have believed that a man like Graham Blackthorne would be unattached, available, genuinely interested in someone like her? "Graham?" Her voice sounded strange, distant even to her own ears. "Victoria Ashford is on line 1. She says she's your fiancé." The change in Graham's expression was immediate and devastating. Color drained from his face, and he set down his pen with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain control. Victoria. The name escaped him like a sigh, heavy with history and complication. Do you want me to leave?" Jasmine asked, already rising from her chair. "No." Graham's response was sharp, almost desperate. "Stay, please." He picked up the phone, his professional mask sliding into place, but Jasmine could see the tension in his shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on the receiver. "Victoria, this is unexpected." Jasmine couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she watched Graham's face as he listened, saw resignation settle over his features like a familiar, unwelcome coat. "Yes, I received your father's message. No, I haven't changed my mind. The arrangements are proceeding as planned." Each word felt like a small death. Jasmine focused on her computer screen, pretending to work while her world crumbled around her. She'd been such a fool. 3 days of playing dress-up in expensive clothes couldn't change the fundamental truth. She was still just the housekeeping girl who'd been foolish enough to believe in fairy tales. "The Aurora Ball is next month," Graham was saying. "Yes, I expect you'll want to make an announcement." "Of course, I understand." When he finally hung up, the silence in the office was deafening. Jasmine kept her eyes fixed on her computer, not trusting herself to look at him without revealing everything she'd allowed herself to feel. "Jasmine, it's fine," she said quickly. her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Your personal life is none of my business. I'm just here to manage your schedule and correspondence." "It's not what you think. I think you're engaged to a woman named Victoria Ashford, and I think I've been incredibly naive." She finally looked at him, forcing her expression into something resembling professional neutrality. "But like I said, it's not my business." Graham stood abruptly, crossing to her desk with swift, determined strides. He braced his hands on either side of her chair, leaning down until their faces were inches apart. "You're wrong," he said fiercely. "About all of it." "Am I?" Jasmine's composure cracked slightly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're planning to announce your engagement at some ball next month." "It's complicated." "No, Graham, it's really not." She stood, forcing him to step back, and smoothed her skirt with hands that only trembled slightly. "You're engaged, I work for you. End of story." But as she returned to her computer, pretending the call hadn't changed everything, she caught Graham's reflection in the dark monitor screen. He was staring at her with an expression of such longing and frustration that it took her breath away. And despite everything, despite Victoria Ashford and engagement announcements and all the reasons this was impossible, Jasmine realized she was falling deeper in love with a man she could never have. The rain against the office windows matched the storm brewing in Graham's chest. It had been 2 weeks since Victoria's call, and the careful, professional distance Jasmine maintained felt like a physical ache. She arrived each morning in those perfectly tailored suits, her hair styled in elegant waves, looking every inch the competent executive assistant she'd become. But the easy warmth in her eyes had been replaced by polite efficiency, and Graham found himself missing the woman who used to hum while dusting his books. She was brilliant at the job, anticipating his needs, managing his impossible schedule with grace, handling difficult clients with a diplomacy that impressed even his most cynical business partners. But she treated him like any other employer now, and the loss of their tentative intimacy was killing him slowly. "Your 3 p.m. appointment is here," Jasmine announced from the doorway, her voice professionally neutral. "The wedding planner." Graham's jaw tightened. He'd forgotten about the appointment Victoria had scheduled, another step in the choreographed dance toward a marriage he didn't want. "Send her in," he said without looking up from his computer. But Jasmine didn't leave immediately. When he finally glanced at her, he caught something vulnerable in her expression before she quickly masked it. "Graham?" Her voice was softer now, almost uncertain. "Is there anything specific I should know about your preferences for the planning?" The question hung between them, loaded with everything they couldn't say. Graham realized this was the first time in 2 weeks she'd asked him something personal, the first crack in the professional wall she'd built between them. "My preferences don't matter much in this situation," he said quietly. Something flickered in her eyes, pain maybe or disappointment, but before he could decipher it, she'd retreated behind her assistant mask. "I'll send Ms. Morrison in." The wedding planner was everything Graham expected: efficient, expensive, and completely focused on creating an event that would photograph well in society magazines. She spread fabric samples across his desk, chattering about venue options and seasonal flower arrangements, while Graham tried to focus on anything except the quiet sound of Jasmine typing in the outer office. "The Aurora Ball will be the perfect venue for the announcement," Ms. Morrison was saying. "Victoria mentioned you've attended for several years. Such a romantic tradition. Where did you two first meet?" "Harvard Business School," Graham replied automatically. "Our families have known each other for years." "How wonderful. A real fairy tale romance." The planner beamed at him with the kind of professional enthusiasm that made Graham's skin crawl. "And the bride will be stunning in cathedral length. Victoria has such classic features she'll photograph beautifully." Graham made appropriate noises while his mind wandered to a different woman entirely. Jasmine wouldn't look classic in a wedding gown. She'd look luminous, real, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Mr. Blackthorne?" The planner's voice cut through his reverie. "Did you have any thoughts on the ceremony music?" "Whatever Victoria prefers," he said, the words tasting like ash. After the planner finally left, the office fell into uncomfortable silence. Graham could hear Jasmine organizing files in the outer office, each rustle of paper a reminder of her careful distance. He stood at his window watching Seattle's skyline blur through rain-streaked glass, and made a decision that would either save them both or destroy everything. "Jasmine," his voice carried to the outer office. "Could you come in here, please?" She appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, every inch the perfect assistant, but Graham had learned to read the subtle signs. The way her fingers tightened on the device when she was nervous, the almost imperceptible straightening of her spine when she was preparing to protect herself. "Close the door." Her eyes flicked to his face, searching for clues about his intentions, but she complied without question. "You have questions," he said without preamble. About Victoria, about the engagement. Ask them. Jasmine's professional composure wavered. Graham, that's not appropriate. Your personal life has been affecting your work for 2 weeks. It was a lie, but a necessary one. Her work had been flawless. You can barely look at me anymore. You flinch when I hand you documents. Whatever you're thinking, it's worse than the truth. She set down her tablet with careful precision, and when she looked at him, he saw a flash of the real Jasmine beneath the assistant facade. Fine. Are you in love with her? The question hit him like a physical blow. Graham had expected curiosity about the wedding timeline, maybe professional concerns about how the marriage might affect her position. He hadn't expected such brutal directness. No. But you're marrying her anyway? Yes. Jasmine absorbed this with the same calm efficiency she brought to managing his impossible schedule, but Graham caught the way her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in front of her. Why? This was the question he'd been dreading, the one that would force him to reveal the ugly practicalities that governed his world. Because my grandfather's will requires it. The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Jasmine's eyes widened, and Graham saw her sharp mind immediately grasping the implications. The inheritance, she said quietly. $50 million in trust funds, plus controlling interest in Blackthorn Industries. Graham's voice was bitter with self-loathing. But only if I'm married by my 38th birthday to someone from an appropriate family. Victoria's father and mine arranged the engagement when we were in college. It was always understood that we'd eventually marry for money. Jasmine's voice held no judgment, but Graham heard the disappointment anyway. Marry for survival. Without that inheritance, I lose the company my great-grandfather built. 1,500 employees lose their jobs. The Ashford merger that's been in negotiation for 3 years falls apart. He ran a hand through his hair, destroying its perfect styling. I've been trying to find another way for months, but the will is ironclad. And your birthday? February 14th. Jasmine did the math quickly. Less than 4 months. 3 months and 12 days. The precision of his answer revealed how often he'd been counting down to his own emotional execution. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of impossible circumstances settling between them like a physical presence. So you'll marry her, Jasmine said finally. Announce it at the Aurora Ball, have a perfect society wedding, and live a perfectly miserable life. I'll marry her, Graham confirmed, but not for the reasons you think. Then why? Graham moved closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough that her subtle perfume made his head spin. Because the alternative is losing you entirely. As long as I'm unmarried, as long as there's a possibility of something between us, you'll keep pulling away to protect yourself. But once I'm married, he took a shaky breath, once I'm married, you'll stay, as my assistant, as someone in my life, even if it can't be the way I want. The admission hung between them, raw and desperate and completely honest. Jasmine stared at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. You're willing to marry someone you don't love, just to keep me close. I'm willing to marry someone I don't love, because I can't have the woman I do love, and having you near me in any capacity is better than not having you at all. The words escaped before Graham could stop them, a confession he'd been holding back for weeks. Jasmine's sharp intake of breath told him she'd heard every word, understood every implication. Graham, she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer and a goodbye all at once. I know it's selfish. I know it's not fair to you or to Victoria, but I can't let you go, Jasmine. I've tried and I can't. She stood perfectly still for a heartbeat. 2, 3. Then she moved toward the door with swift, determined steps. I need some air, she said without looking back. Graham watched her leave, knowing he'd just changed everything between them again. But this time he wasn't sure if he'd saved them or destroyed them both. Jasmine found herself in the mansion's garden, rain soaking through her expensive blazer as she struggled to breathe. The perfectly manicured hedges and imported roses blurred through her tears, but she barely noticed the cold November air cutting through her professional armor. Graham's words echoed in her mind like a song she couldn't stop humming. I can't have the woman I do love. He loved her. The man who owned companies in 6 countries, who commanded board meetings with Fortune 500 executives, who lived in a world so far removed from hers, it might as well be another planet. He loved her, and it didn't matter at all. She sank onto a wrought-iron bench hidden beneath a trellis of dormant climbing roses, her carefully styled hair falling loose from its pins. The rain had turned to a fine mist that clung to everything like grief, and Jasmine finally allowed herself to cry for the impossible situation they'd stumbled into. She'd been naive to think their growing connection could lead anywhere real. People like her didn't get fairy tale endings with people like Graham. She cleaned houses and counted bus fare and worried about her brother's medical bills. He attended charity galas and made decisions that affected thousands of employees and had obligations that stretched back generations. But God help her, she loved him too. The realization hit her like a physical force, stealing what little breath she had left. Somewhere between tea services and professional conversations, between his genuine interest in her singing and his quiet kindness toward her family situation, she'd fallen completely, hopelessly in love with Graham Blackthorne. And now she had to watch him marry someone else. Jasmine? She looked up to find Mrs. Holloway approaching with an umbrella and a concerned expression. The older woman had changed into civilian clothes, a simple cardigan and sensible shoes that made her look less like the mansion's head housekeeper and more like the surrogate mother she'd become to Jasmine over the past months. Child, you're soaked to the bone. What are you doing out here? Thinking, Jasmine managed, accepting the umbrella with trembling hands. Mrs. Holloway settled beside her on the bench, seemingly unbothered by the dampness. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, while the Seattle skyline twinkled through the mist beyond the garden walls. Want to talk about it? The older woman finally asked. Jasmine almost laughed at the impossibility of explaining her situation. Where could she even begin? With Graham's confession of love, with her own realization that she'd been fooling herself about her feelings, with the bitter knowledge that none of it mattered because duty and inheritance and family expectations trumped everything else. It's complicated, she said instead. Most things worth caring about are. Mrs. Holloway's voice held the wisdom of someone who'd witnessed decades of human drama within these walls. But sometimes talking helps sort through the complications. He's getting married. The words escaped before Jasmine could stop them, and she immediately regretted the admission. Mrs. Holloway would ask questions she couldn't answer, make connections she couldn't afford to have made, but the older woman simply nodded as if she'd been expecting this revelation. Victoria Ashford, Mrs. Holloway said quietly. I figured as much when she started calling more frequently. You knew. Honey, I've worked for the Blackthorne family for 23 years. I knew about that engagement arrangement before Graham did. Mrs. Holloway's voice carried a mixture of affection and regret. Watch that boy grow up knowing his life wasn't entirely his own. Jasmine stared at her in surprise. You've known all along? Known about the engagement? Yes, known that he was fighting it. Mrs. Holloway smiled sadly. Not until recently. Not until you. The implication hung between them like a bridge Jasmine wasn't sure she wanted to cross. What do you mean? Child, I've watched Graham go through the motions of living for years. Successful, certainly. Responsible to a fault. But not alive. Not until you started working here. The older woman turned to study Jasmine's face. He's different now. Lighter somehow. Like he remembered what it felt like to actually want something instead of just accepting what was expected. It doesn't matter what he wants, Jasmine said bitterly. He has obligations. Does he? The question was so unexpected that Jasmine found herself really looking at Mrs. Holloway for the first time. Beneath the maternal concern, she saw something sharper, the calculating intelligence of someone who'd observed power dynamics for decades. The will stipulates marriage to someone from an appropriate family, Mrs. Holloway continued conversationally. But it doesn't specify which appropriate family. Jasmine's heart stopped. What are you saying? I'm saying that sometimes the obvious solution isn't the only solution, and sometimes the people who think they understand the rules haven't read them carefully enough. Before Jasmine could process this cryptic statement, footsteps approached through the garden paths. Graham appeared through the mist like a man searching for something essential, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his expensive suit jacket abandoned somewhere inside. Jasmine? Relief flooded his voice when he spotted her on the bench. I was worried when you didn't come back. Mrs. Holloway rose smoothly, patting Jasmine's shoulder with maternal affection. I'll leave you two to talk, but remember what I said, dear. Sometimes the most important thing is making sure you understand all your options. She disappeared back toward the house, leaving Jasmine and Graham alone in the misty garden with the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Graham sat beside her on the bench, careful to maintain distance while still being close enough that she could feel his warmth in the cold air. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for putting you in this position. For being selfish enough to confess feelings that only make everything more complicated. Don't apologize for telling the truth. The truth doesn't change anything. I'm still getting married in 3 months. You're still going to have to watch me do it. Jasmine turned to face him fully, taking in the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the carefully controlled desperation in his voice. What if Mrs. Holloway is right? She heard herself ask. What if there are options you haven't considered? Graham's laugh held no humor. I've had the best lawyers in Seattle review that will. There are no loopholes, no alternative interpretations, marriage to Victoria Ashford, or lose everything my family built. She didn't say loopholes, she said making sure you understand all your options. Something flickered in Graham's expression. Hope, maybe, or curiosity. What exactly did she tell you? That the will specifies someone from an appropriate family, but not which family? Graham went very still. That's technically accurate, but irrelevant. There aren't exactly dozens of eligible women from suitable backgrounds who would be interested in a marriage of convenience. Aren't there? The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Jasmine saw the moment Graham understood what she was suggesting, saw his eyes widen with something that looked like hope and terror combined. Jasmine, no, I won't ask that of you. You're not asking. I'm offering. You don't understand what you'd be giving up. A real marriage, a family, a normal life. I understand perfectly. Her voice was steady, certain. I understand that I love you too. The admission escaped like a breath she'd been holding for weeks. Graham's sharp intake of air told her he'd heard every word, understood every implication. You love me, he repeated, as if testing the words for truth. I love you, she confirmed. And if marrying me saves your company and keeps us together, then maybe Mrs. Holloway is right. Maybe we do have options we haven't considered. They sat in the misty garden, the space between their hearts suddenly feeling like the most important distance in the world. And for the first time in months, Graham Blackthorne allowed himself to believe that sometimes the most impossible solutions were the only ones that mattered. The sapphire blue gown transformed Jasmine into someone she barely recognized. Standing before the full-length mirror in the mansion's guest suite, she smoothed the silk fabric over her hips and tried to calm her racing heart. The dress had arrived that morning with a note in Graham's handwriting. For tonight, you'll be beautiful. Beautiful. The word felt foreign applied to herself, but the woman in the mirror looked like she belonged at Seattle's most exclusive charity gala. The deep blue fabric brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, and her hair fell in elegant waves around her bare shoulders. Diamond earrings, borrowed from Mrs. Holloway's personal collection, caught the light like tiny stars. She looked like someone who could stand beside Graham Blackthorne and not seem out of place. If only she felt that way inside. A soft knock interrupted her nervous primping. Come in. Graham appeared in the doorway, devastating in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, and froze when he saw her. The expression on his face made her breath catch, wonder mixed with something deeper, hungrier. Jasmine. Her name escaped him like a prayer. God, you're stunning. Heat flooded her cheeks. I feel like I'm playing dress-up. You look like you were born to wear that dress. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with careful precision. Are you ready for this? The question carried weight beyond the evening's events. Tonight wasn't just about attending a charity gala together. Tonight was about presenting themselves as a couple to Seattle's social elite, testing the waters for a future that still seemed impossible despite their garden confessions a week ago. As ready as I can be, she admitted. Though I still think we're crazy for attempting this. Graham had spent the week researching his grandfather's will with renewed determination, consulting with different lawyers, exploring every possible interpretation of the marriage clause. The results had been cautiously optimistic. While the Ashford engagement had been assumed for years, the will's language was broad enough to accommodate other appropriate families. The challenge would be convincing Seattle society that Jasmine qualified as appropriate. We don't have to do this, Graham said quietly, echoing conversations they'd had every day since the garden. I can still marry Victoria, honor the original arrangement, and spend the rest of your life wondering what if. Jasmine shook her head. We've come this far. Let's see what happens when we stop hiding. Graham moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the nervous tension he was trying to hide beneath his confident exterior. There's something I need to give you, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Jasmine's heart stuttered when he withdrew a small velvet box, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was strategy, not romance, a necessary prop for their performance tonight. It was my grandmother's, Graham said, opening the box to reveal a vintage engagement ring, a perfect solitaire diamond surrounded by smaller sapphires that matched her dress exactly. She would have liked you. The words hit her harder than expected. This wasn't just about fulfilling legal requirements anymore. Graham was offering her a piece of his family history, a connection to the legacy he was trying to preserve. Graham, I can't. This is too precious to use for pretending. We're not pretending. His voice was firm, certain. Not about this, not about us. He took her left hand, and Jasmine felt her world shift as the ring slid onto her finger with perfect precision, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Jasmine Rowe, Graham said formally, though his eyes held anything but formality. "Will you marry me?" The proposal was theatre, necessary for what came next, but the emotion in his voice was entirely real. Jasmine found herself nodding before she could think too carefully about all the reasons this was insane. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll marry you." Graham's smile transformed his entire face, and for a moment, Jasmine forgot about wills and inheritance and social expectations. For a moment, she was just a woman saying yes to the man she loved. The Aurora Ball was held at the Olympic Club, Seattle's most exclusive venue, and Jasmine felt every eye in the room tracking their entrance. Graham's hand rested possessively on the small of her back as they navigated through crowds of elegantly dressed guests, his confidence helping to steady her nerves. "Breathe," he murmured in her ear as they approached a group of his business associates. "You belong here." The evening passed in a blur of introductions and careful conversations. Jasmine discovered she had a natural talent for listening to people's stories, for asking questions that made them feel interesting rather than interrogated. Graham watched her charm his colleagues with something that looked like amazement, his pride in her evident to anyone paying attention. But the real test came when Victoria Ashford arrived. Jasmine spotted her across the ballroom, a vision in white silk and inherited jewelry, moving through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her place in the world. She was beautiful in the classical way that photographed well in society magazines, all sharp cheekbones and perfect posture. "She's here," Jasmine said quietly. Graham followed her gaze, his expression tightening. "Are you ready?" Before Jasmine could answer, Victoria was approaching with the determined stride of someone accustomed to claiming what belonged to her. "Graham, darling." Victoria's voice carried the crisp authority of old money as she leaned in to kiss his cheek, pointedly ignoring Jasmine's presence. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about tonight." "Victoria," Graham's tone was politely distant. "I'd like you to meet Jasmine Rowe, my fiancée." The words dropped into the space between them like stones into still water. Victoria's perfectly composed expression cracked for just a moment, surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hurt flickering across her features. "I'm sorry." "What?" "We're engaged," Graham repeated, his arms sliding around Jasmine's waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "The announcement will be in tomorrow's papers." Victoria's gaze moved to Jasmine for the first time, taking in the sapphire dress, the vintage ring, the way Graham held her like she was precious. "I see," Victoria said finally, her voice steady despite the shock in her eyes. "How unexpected." "Love usually is," Jasmine found herself saying, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Victoria studied her for a long moment, and Jasmine saw the exact moment when the other woman recognized her as a real threat rather than a temporary distraction. "Well," Victoria said with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, "congratulations. I'm sure you'll be very happy together." She melted back into the crowd with practiced grace, but Jasmine caught sight of her pulling out her phone with urgent precision. Within minutes, whispered conversations were spreading through the ballroom as news of Graham's unexpected engagement rippled through Seattle's social elite. "That went better than expected," Graham said quietly. "Did it?" Jasmine watched Victoria's animated phone conversation across the room. "Because I think we just declared war." Graham followed her gaze, his expression hardening as he recognized the implications of Victoria's reaction. "Let her make her calls," he said firmly. "Let them all talk. By tomorrow morning everyone will know that Graham Blackthorne is marrying Jasmine Rowe, and there won't be anything anyone can do to stop it." But as they danced together later that evening, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria Ashford wasn't the type of woman who accepted defeat gracefully, and she was absolutely right. The lawyer's office felt like a battlefield disguised as mahogany and leather. Jasmine sat beside Graham at the polished conference table, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, while across from them, Victoria Ashford's legal team arranged documents with military precision. It had been 3 days since the Aurora Ball, 3 days since their public announcement, and Victoria had wasted no time in mounting her counterattack. The engagement contract between the Blackthorne and Ashford families has been in place for over a decade, Victoria's lead attorney was saying, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. "My client has every reasonable expectation that Mr. Blackthorne would honor that commitment." Graham's lawyer, Theodore Marsh, responded with equal formality. "There is no legal contract, merely a social understanding between families. My client is under no legal obligation to marry Ms. Ashford." "Perhaps not legally," Victoria interjected, speaking for the first time since they'd assembled. She looked impeccable as always, her blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon, her navy suit tailored to precision. But Jasmine caught the steel beneath her composed exterior. But there are other considerations. She slid a manila folder across the table toward Graham. I think you should see this before you make any irreversible decisions. Graham opened the folder, and Jasmine watched his face drain of color as he scanned the contents. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek, and when he looked up at Victoria, his eyes held something dangerous. What is this? Insurance, Victoria replied smoothly, in case you were having second thoughts about our arrangement. Jasmine leaned closer to read over Graham's shoulder, her heart sinking as she processed the documents. Private investigator reports, financial records, medical bills, a comprehensive dossier on her life and Damon's condition. Your brother's medical expenses are quite substantial, Victoria continued conversationally. Cerebral palsy treatments, physical therapy, specialized equipment. I imagine it's been a significant burden for someone in your circumstances. Leave my family out of this, Jasmine said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Oh, but family is exactly what this is about. Victoria's smile was razor-sharp. You see, I've done my research on you, Jasmine, very thoroughly. That scholarship program that's covering Damon's college courses, it's funded by a foundation that the Ashford family supports quite generously. The clinic where he receives his treatments, we're major donors there as well. The implications hit Jasmine like a physical blow. Victoria wasn't just threatening her, she was threatening Damon, the most important person in her world. You can't be serious, Graham said, his voice deadly quiet. I'm always serious about protecting my interests. Victoria leaned back in her chair, completely in control. I'm not asking you to abandon your infatuation, Graham. Keep her as a mistress if you must. But you will marry me, as planned. And if you don't, she let the threat hang in the air, unspoken, but perfectly clear. Damon loses his scholarship, Jasmine finished quietly. His medical support gets withdrawn. Funding gets redirected to more deserving recipients. Victoria corrected with false sympathy. Such a shame when resources become limited. Graham stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with violent force. You're threatening to destroy an innocent young man's future, because you can't accept that I don't love you. I'm protecting a merger that's been years in the making, maintaining family agreements that predate your current emotional confusion. Victoria's composure never wavered. Love is a luxury, Graham. Duty is a necessity. Duty. Graham's laugh held no humor. Is that what you call this extortion? I call it reality. Victoria rose to face him across the table. How you have a choice to make. Honor your commitments to me, or watch the consequences ripple through the lives of people you claim to care about. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Jasmine felt the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She looked at Graham's tortured expression and knew he was calculating the same terrible math she was, weighing his happiness against Damon's future. There's a third option, Jasmine said quietly. Everyone in the room turned to look at her, but she kept her eyes fixed on Graham's face. I withdraw from the equation entirely. Jasmine, no, let me finish. She stood, moving around the table to face Victoria directly. You want Graham to honor his family obligations? Fine, but I won't let you destroy my brother to get what you want. How noble, Victoria said with false admiration, but I'm afraid it's too late for dramatic sacrifices. The damage to our family arrangements has already been done. The gossip, the embarrassment, can be fixed, Jasmine interrupted. A broken engagement can be explained. A grieving fiancé who realized he was moving too fast after losing someone important to him. That's a story society will accept. Graham stared at her in horror. What are you saying? Jasmine met his eyes, pouring everything she felt into her gaze. Love, regret, fierce protectiveness for the future she was about to sacrifice. I'm saying I made a mistake. We both did. We got caught up in something that was never realistic. Her voice was steady, professional, giving no hint of the way her heart was shattering. You belong with someone from your world, someone who understands the responsibilities that come with your position. Jasmine, someone like Victoria. The name fell between them like a blade. Graham's face went white, then flushed with anger and desperation. I won't let you do this. I won't let her force you into sacrificing our future. What future? Jasmine's careful composure cracked slightly. One where we're always looking over our shoulders, always worried about who might get hurt because we dared to want something we couldn't have. That's not love, Graham, that's selfishness. Victoria watched this exchange with satisfaction, but Jasmine wasn't finished. However, she continued, turning back to face the other woman, My withdrawal comes with conditions. Victoria's eyebrows rose. You're hardly in a position to make demands. Aren't I? Jasmine's voice hardened. Because if anything, and I mean anything, happens to interfere with my brother's education or medical care, if any of your family's charitable contributions suddenly become unavailable to him, I'll make sure every society reporter in Seattle knows exactly how you manipulated your way to this altar. Are you threatening me? I'm promising you. Jasmine stepped closer, and for the first time Victoria looked uncertain. I might not have your money or your connections, but I have something you'll never understand. The absolute willingness to burn down anyone who threatens my family. Cross me on this and I'll destroy your reputation so thoroughly that no amount of family money will repair it. The room fell silent again, but this time the tension crackled with different energy. Victoria was recalculating, recognizing that she might have underestimated her opponent. Agreed, Victoria said finally. Your brother's support continues uninterrupted, and you disappear from Graham's life permanently. Jasmine, please, Graham said desperately. There has to be another way. There isn't. She turned to him one last time, memorizing his face, storing away the love and anguish she saw there. Take care of yourself, Graham. Be happy. Not without you. The words broke something fundamental in her chest, but Jasmine forced herself to smile. Yes, without me. That's how love works sometimes. We let go of what we want to protect what matters most. She was halfway to the door when Graham's voice stopped her. Wait! Everyone turned to look at him, and Jasmine saw something new in his expression. Not defeat, but a terrible, brilliant determination. Victoria, he said quietly, you're absolutely right about duty and family obligations. Which is why I need to tell you something about my grandfather's will that apparently no one bothered to explain to you. Victoria's confidence wavered slightly. What do you mean? Graham smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression Jasmine had ever seen on his face. The marriage requirement? It doesn't just specify someone from an appropriate family. It specifies someone I choose freely, without coercion or manipulation. His voice grew stronger with each word. My grandfather wanted to ensure I married for the right reasons, not just social convenience. Any engagement entered into under duress, say, through blackmail or threats to innocent third parties, would invalidate the entire inheritance. The blood drained from Victoria's face as she understood the implications. You have no proof. I have a room full of witnesses and a recorded conversation. Graham gestured toward his lawyer, who was indeed holding a small recording device. Are your threats against Damon's medical care, your admission of using financial manipulation to force my compliance, all documented? Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. You can't do this. Our families have agreements. Our families made suggestions. I'm making a choice. Graham moved to Jasmine's side, taking her trembling hand in his. The choice my grandfather intended me to make freely. He turned to face Jasmine fully, and she saw her own love reflected back at her in his eyes. Jasmine Rowe, will you marry me? Not because of wills or inheritance or social obligations, but because I love you and can't imagine a future without you in it? Through her tears, through the impossible joy blooming in her chest, Jasmine found her voice. Yes, Graham. Yes, I'll marry you. And as Victoria's lawyers frantically shuffled papers and muttered about appeals, as the afternoon sun streamed through the office windows like a blessing, Jasmine finally understood what Mrs. Holloway had meant about understanding all their options. Sometimes the most important choice was simply choosing love over fear. 2 years later, the morning light filtering through the kitchen windows of their Queen Anne home caught the gold in Jasmine's wedding ring as she hummed softly while making coffee. It was the same hymn her grandmother used to sing, the one Graham had first heard her humming in his library that day that changed everything. But now the melody filled a space that belonged to both of them, a renovated Victorian house with creaky floors and imperfect charm, nothing like the sterile perfection of the Blackthorn mansion. You're up early. Graham's voice came from the doorway, rough with sleep and affection. Jasmine turned to find her husband of 18 months, leaning against the doorframe in rumpled pajama pants and a faded college t-shirt, his hair sticking up at impossible angles. He looked nothing like the intimidating businessman she'd once served tea to, and everything like the man who'd chosen love over duty on a cold November afternoon. Damon's graduation is today, she reminded him, moving into his arms with the easy intimacy of people who'd learned to trust completely in each other. I wanted to make sure everything was perfect. Graham pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the contentment they'd built together day by day. It will be perfect because you planned it, just like everything else in our life. Through the kitchen window, They could see the small garden Jasmine had planted in their backyard, vegetables and herbs mixed with the roses Graham had transplanted from his family's mansion. It was beautifully imperfect, practical and lovely in equal measure, like everything they'd created together. The past 2 years had been a masterclass in building a life from scratch. Graham had kept his word about the inheritance, but they'd discovered something neither had expected. They didn't need the Blackthorn fortune to be happy. Graham's smaller investments and consulting work provided more than enough for their simple lifestyle, while Jasmine had returned to school, earning her business degree with Graham's encouragement and support. Victoria had disappeared to Europe after the legal debacle, reportedly engaged to a titled but impoverished Italian count. The society pages occasionally mentioned her attending charity events in Rome or Monaco, always photographed with a brittle smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Is he nervous?" Graham asked, settling at their small kitchen table with the coffee Jasmine handed him. "Terrified," she admitted with a smile, "but excited. Full scholarship to the University of Washington's engineering program, plus that internship at Microsoft lined up for next summer." Damon had thrived over the past 2 years, his quick mind and natural humor making him popular among his classmates. The specialized equipment Graham had quietly arranged, better wheelchair, upgraded computer setup, modified workspace, had opened doors Damon hadn't even known existed. "He's brilliant," Graham said simply, "just like his sister. His sister who used to clean houses for a living. His sister who managed to capture the heart of a supposedly heartless businessman, negotiate her way through Seattle's social elite, and outmaneuver one of the city's most connected families." Graham's smile was soft with pride. "Intelligence was never the question, Jasmine. You just finally got the chance to show the world what I saw from the beginning." The doorbell interrupted their morning quiet, and Jasmine went to answer it, expecting the florist or caterer for the graduation party they were hosting that afternoon. Instead, she found Mrs. Holloway on their front porch, holding a wrapped package and wearing the kind of knowing smile that meant she had news to share. "Good morning, dear. I hope you don't mind me stopping by so early." "Never," Jasmine said warmly, embracing the woman who'd become like a second mother to her. "Come in. Graham's in the kitchen." Mrs. Holloway had left the Blackthorn mansion 6 months after Graham and Jasmine's wedding, claiming she wanted to enjoy retirement. In reality, she'd become their unofficial family advisor, the bridge between their old lives and their new one. "I brought something for Damon's graduation," she said, settling at the kitchen table while Graham poured her coffee. "But I also wanted to share some news." She handed Jasmine the package, clearly a book, wrapped in elegant paper, then leaned back with the satisfied expression of someone about to deliver delicious gossip. "Victoria Ashford's engagement was announced in this week's European papers," she said without preamble, "to Count Alessandro Di Marco. Apparently it's quite the romantic story, love at first sight at a charity gala in Venice." "Good for her," Jasmine said, and meant it. "Everyone deserves to find happiness. Even people who try to destroy other people's happiness?" Graham's tone was skeptical. "Especially those people," Jasmine replied firmly. Hurt people, but healed people can heal people too. Maybe Italy will be good for her." Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. "You always did see the best in everyone, child. It's one of the things that makes you perfect for that stubborn husband of yours." "I'm sitting right here," Graham protested mildly, "and you should be grateful every day that she chose you, despite your many flaws." Mrs. Holloway shot back with maternal authority. "I am," Graham said simply, his eyes finding Jasmine's across the table, "every single day." The afternoon graduation ceremony was everything Jasmine had hoped it would be. Damon rolled across the stage to receive his diploma with the same confident smile he'd inherited from their grandmother, and when the dean announced his full scholarship to the university's engineering program, the cheers from his family section were loud enough to be heard 3 rows away. Later, at the party in their backyard, Jasmine stood on their small porch watching Graham explain some investment principle to Damon while their friends and neighbors mingled below. The scene was perfectly ordinary, folding chairs and grocery store flowers, paper plates and homemade cake, but it felt more precious than any society gala she'd ever attended. "You look thoughtful," Mrs. Holloway said, joining her on the porch. "Just grateful," Jasmine replied. 2 years ago I thought my life was about staying invisible, keeping my head down, not asking for too much. And now I know that sometimes the most extraordinary life comes from having the courage to be exactly who you are, no matter who's watching." She looked down at her left hand, where Graham's grandmother's ring caught the afternoon light. The diamond and sapphires seemed to wink at her, as if the ring itself approved of the life they'd built together. "He's good for you," Mrs. Holloway observed, following her gaze to where Graham was now being soundly beaten at chess by Damon. "We're good for each other," Jasmine corrected. "He taught me I was worth more than I thought I was. I taught him that money and status don't matter as much as connection and authenticity." "And what have you learned together?" Jasmine considered the question as she watched her husband laugh at something her brother had said, his face lit with genuine joy. "That love isn't about finding someone who fits into your existing life," she said finally. "It's about finding someone worth building a completely new life with." As the sun set behind the Seattle skyline, painting their small backyard in shades of gold and rose, Jasmine felt the same sense of rightness she'd experienced the first time Graham had asked her to call him by his name. This was where she belonged, not because someone had elevated her to their level, but because two people had chosen to meet each other exactly where they were and build something beautiful together. That night, after the guests had gone home and the dishes were done, Jasmine and Graham sat on their front porch swing, watching the city lights twinkle below them. "Any regrets?" Graham asked quietly, his arm around her shoulders as they rocked gently back and forth. Jasmine thought about the question seriously. Did she regret the mansion she'd never own, the society events she'd never attend as anything more than hired help, the life of luxury that might have been hers if she'd been born into different circumstances? "Only one," she said finally. Graham tensed slightly. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me so long to believe I deserved to be happy." His arm tightened around her, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. "We have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time," he murmured against her hair. "Yes," Jasmine agreed, settling more comfortably against his chest. "We do." Above them, the first stars were appearing in the Seattle sky, and somewhere in the distance she could hear someone humming. Maybe a neighbor, maybe just the wind. Maybe the voice of her grandmother blessing the life her granddaughter had finally learned to claim. Either way, it sounded like joy. Have you ever realized that your biggest dreams were actually too small? Sometimes the life we never dared to imagine is exactly the life we were meant to live. What would you risk for a love that sees you exactly as you are and loves you not, despite your imperfections, but because of your authenticity? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.